Have you ever taken a bunch of images only to realize that your camera settings were set on the previously set settings from the night before or something like that, and they're all out of whack and wrong for the shoot that you're currently doing? Well, I've definitely done that. I think it's a common problem for a lot of photographers because we can manually change so many things and we forget to put them back, and it means that the next time we shoot, we might be shooting with incorrect settings. Well, for those of you who don't know me very well personally, I'm actually a pilot as well. Now, in aviation, we use a lot of checklists. This is my checklist for a Bonanza A36 that I used to own. And we've got, checklists for before takeoff, during takeoff, after takeoff, cruise settings, before landing, you name it. There's heaps of them. The other thing in aviation that they have is they have a lot of acronyms that are easy to remember, because there are times when you've got a very high workload in aviation where using a checklist may not be very easy to do. So there's a few with acronyms. So I thought, why not apply this to photography? There's a couple of times when I've gone out, I've done a shoot, and I've got halfway through that shoot and realized that my ISO was high, or I was in JPEGs rather than RAW, or something was just out of whack. And that made me think, well, I need to create a checklist. So that's exactly what I did. Now, you can download this checklist if you like at my website, which is on3legs, which is with the number 3.com/checklist. So on3legs.com/checklist. The link will be down below in the description. But I'm going to take you through each part of the checklist here in the video right now. But if you download that checklist, it's also going to give you 8 tips along with the 8 different things that I set up in this checklist. Now, the checklist uses an acronym that's really easy to remember. The word is firmware. Of course, this is your firmware right here, the good old camera body. And the checklist is about setting this up so you're just ready at any time to go out for a shoot. Because, like I said, I've been out for a shoot before, got a few images off of something spectacular happening. I was in a rush and my ISO was high, or maybe I didn't have the right white balance or something like that. So the checklist really makes it easy. And the word firmware, nice and easy to remember, and each of the 8 letters stands for a setting on the camera, which we'll run through right now. So the F is for your focus mode. So I always shoot in single point autofocus. The way that I shoot landscapes is I'll put it into autofocus, I'll press the screen on the back, I have that set up for autofocus, I'll find an area of really high contrast that I want to focus on, I'll click it, I'll let the camera autofocus, and then I'll switch it into manual. So it's not unusual for me to forget to switch this back into auto. So for me, the 2 things that I check with focus is, have I reselected single point autofocus? That's if I've moved it. And is it in the middle? And then the other thing is, is it in autofocus, ready for my shoot? So that's the focus. The I in firmware is then for ISO. I can't tell you how many times I've gone out on a shoot. And you know what happens is I do a lot of sunrises. You get up really stupid early, like maybe 3:30, 4 a.m. You drive out, you're still a bit tired, haven't had enough coffee yet. And you just, I'm just not on my game. So I've left the ISO at 1600 or 3200 or worse, 6400 after doing like an astrophotography shoot or something, night photography. Taken a round of photos of a beautiful sunrise only to realize my ISO was high and I didn't notice. So just silly, but it happens. That's why I've got this checklist. So the I is to check my ISO. I always set mine back down to the base ISO of 64. The R in firmware, which is the 3rd letter, is for RAW. Am I shooting in RAW? Sometimes I've used this camera just for some snaps, maybe taking photos of something to sell, like a car, or something for on eBay or Gumtree. Well, of course, I don't need a big RAW file for that, so I'll switch it over to the smaller JPEG file, take the photos for whatever I'm listing, and maybe I've forgotten to put it back. It's certainly happened to me. So I always check that I'm back in RAW. Okay, so every time, just quickly check, am I in RAW? Because otherwise, I don't want to come back and have very small JPEG files. They're useless to me the way that I shoot landscapes, because I expose for the highlights, and in a JPEG, you can never bring the shadows up. The M is for metering mode. Sometimes I might change from my matrix metering to center weighted or spot metering depending on what it is I'm shooting. And I really like to be in matrix metering, which is, or evaluative in the Canon language, means it meters the whole scene. So I always want to double check that I'm in the metering mode. So that's the F, I, M, R, and the M. That's the firm. Now we're going to go on to ware, which is W-A-R-E. So the W is for my white balance. So of course, what I want to do is I want to make sure that my white balance is set to auto. Now it doesn't really matter for me. Sometimes, because I'm shooting raw, I can change it later. But I like to get an idea of what it's going to look like when I'm taking the photos. And if the colors aren't right in my preview, sometimes I'll actually change the white balance to get the colors that I want in my preview. So if you're doing the same thing, you might find your white balance is not set. So I always like to put it back into auto. So I just like to double check that and make sure that my white balance is in auto. The A is for aperture priority. Now this might be different for everybody. I shoot 95% of my landscape images in aperture priority. So sometimes I'll put it into manual, or I'll put it into shutter priority, or I'll move that dial. And it's just a way for me to make sure that I've put it back into aperture priority, which is my method of taking photos. And once again, it just means that when I rock up to my shoot, I'm not having to think about anything. It's all preset, ready to go, and I know that I can just start clicking images. Now the second R, so that we've had one R in firm, now we've got one in wear, is to make sure I've got my remote release sorted out. So I never remove this little antenna, which is the receiver for the remote release. Luckily this one operates off of the camera battery. I do need to make sure it's switched off or it will drain the battery. So when I get back and I do my checklist, I make sure that's switched off. The other thing I make sure is that I've got my batteries in my main shutter release, and in the button itself are good batteries and ready to go. I never want to go to a shoot without my remote shutter release, because I just love shooting without having to touch the camera. I find I get much sharper images, especially if you're on soft sand or something. Even standing near your tripod in the sand can move your camera around. So sometimes it's good to be able to take a step back or two and use the remote release. So it's very important that I've got the remote release set. And then the E, which is the very end of firmware, is for my exposure compensation. So the exposure comp is one of the most often used settings on my camera, which I think a lot of people don't use, but I do. I leave it in matrix metering and I use the exposure comp and I expose for the highlights. So I'm constantly moving it around. And so it's not unusual. I've had it before where I've just, once again, nice and early in the morning, started shooting, going, what's wrong with my camera? It's so dark, and just not even thought to check it. It just, I don't know why, but it just happens. So, that means I get my exposure comp and I set it back to the 0 at the end of a shoot or before a shoot when I go through the checklist. So there you go. So there's the 8 things: firmware, focus, ISO, RAW, metering mode, white balance, aperture priority, remote release, and exposure compensation. And you can just commit that to memory. Finish your shoot. Before you put your camera back in the bag, just go through that checklist, put it away, and you know that the minute you have to rush out the door for something to shoot, that your camera is just ready to go. Now, as I said, you can download the checklist in a full PDF format. I did a beautiful PDF up with some helpful tips for each of the 8 areas, and why, or what settings I might use, or how I might use those settings to shoot the landscapes that I shoot. So you can head to On 3 Legs, which is with the letter 3, on3legs.com/checklist, and you can download a copy of that for free. Go and grab that checklist, pop it in your camera bag until you commit it to memory. And then once you've got the checklist committed to memory, then you won't need the checklist in your bag anymore, or on your phone, or wherever you put it. You'll be able to just do what I do and just go through and make sure your camera's set up properly. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this video and you found it helpful. If you did, you know what to do. And until next time, I hope you get out there and take some photos. See ya.